All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Gabriel Grubak, part of the team that's leading the special geothermal talks. Really happy to have you all here today. Happy to have our speaker, um, Shruti, who's here today with us. This is our 15th special talk. I would say I'm personally proud of it because it was one of those engagements initiatives that started last year, and we kicked it off doing it once a month, and it was pretty amazing that we managed to bring together 13 sections from all over Europe in terms of echoing the geothermal message. There's been a lot of momentum lately. Geothermal has been around for many, many years. That's a little bit of a misconception. In some of the talks that we have is it's been around for so long, but finally now it's getting its spot where it needs to be in terms of attention and investments, and hopefully that will keep growing. And that's why we have Shruti here today to tell us a little more about that. I would like to introduce our speaker, Shruti Raghuram. She's a senior analyst and a product manager on the geothermal solution at Rystad Energy. Her main area of research is the global geothermal power generation and heating market. Within these sectors, she's done extensive research on the macro and micro trends impacting the market and forecasting for various geographical markets. Shruti has worked closely with the geothermal industry, from suppliers looking to understand their future opportunities to developers understanding the cost and risk picture of their targeted developments to financial institutions making investment within the geothermal industry. She holds a bachelor's degree in electrical and electronics engineering from Velour Institute of Technology. I'm really, really happy to have her here today because these are the questions that we keep asking. Is when do these projects kick off? How do we make it happen? What is the situation in the industry? So really happy to have you here with us, Shruti. I'll pass it over to you, and then after that we'll have our Q&A, and looking forward to the question of the audience. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And hello, everyone. I'm just reintroducing myself there. My name is Shruti, and as Gabrielle mentioned, I'm a product manager and senior analyst here at Rystad. So today we have a what I hope to be a very exciting talk for you all, where I'll be talking about all the key trends happening in the geothermal space, and then focusing more specifically on what's happening in Europe. So we have a very packed agenda today. So I'll be talking about a lot of different topics which are listed on the screen right now. So I'll be beginning with a short brief on what we are at Rystad Energy and what we do, since I think there are many of you who do not know much about what we do as a company. So I'll be talking a bit about that. Then I'll be focusing on what's happening in the market today as a global perspective on both the power generation and the heating side of things. Then we do a quick deep dive on Europe and understand how geothermal can really be leveraged to boost the EU's decarbonization efforts. We'll also talk about the impact that policies have in shaping the geothermal landscape and the geothermal development base of countries, as that is a key topic that's of interest in the entire industry today. We'll talk about the different co-location opportunities that geothermal offers, which then further incentivize developers to enter the geothermal space. We'll also conclude this session with a quick qualitative view on how geothermal can grow beyond the conventional hotspots that exist today, and what are the key challenges that need to be tackled for geothermal to have its geothermal decade. We'll conclude this session with a quick Q&A as well, where I hope to answer all of your questions. Now, talking a bit about what we do at Rystad Energy. We are a global energy knowledge house which provides advisory and analysis solutions for the energy sector, spanning the length and breadth of the entire energy ecosystem, ranging from oil and gas to renewables, clean technologies such as carbon capture storage, hydrogen, and so on, and also their supply chains. We have a global presence with over 700 employees sitting in over 30 offices, which provide us access to all of these key energy markets and keep us up to date on all the trends that are emerging in the energy ecosystem. Now, speaking about the geothermal solution very specifically, it is what we like to call the digital twin of everything that's happening in the geothermal space. It is a database that covers more than 2,000 projects globally for every medium deep to deep geothermal project that exists today. So, just to give you a definition of what we consider medium deep to deep geothermal, is basically projects which have wells deeper than 500 meters. So this database essentially has a list has is a database of over 20,000 geothermal production and injection wells, both historically and in the future pipeline. Using all of these information on all of these individual projects, we are able to aggregate it to build a macro picture of everything that's happening in the industry today. So that basically tells you that it is a bottom-up database. Speaking a bit about how we capture this information, that is a question that I get quite often because, especially when you're looking at the forecast side of things, historically, yes, we take all publicly available information. So, everything ranging from information disclosed by developers, reports put out by the government, suppliers announcing contract awards, research papers done on the various exploration studies or the geophysical, geochemical studies, all of those type of publicly available information is captured by us in all languages, and then we take that and we add it to the database to basically build out the top line of any particular country operator or the even on a global level. But about the forecast, so how we capture that information is basically we look at the government's targets as a starting point. What we do is basically, for example, if a country, for example, Indonesia, puts out a government target that they wish to reach an install capacity of, say, 5.5 gigawatts by 2030, we take that number as a starting point. And then we break that down to all the projects that are operational and all the projects that are in the pipeline to be operational by 2030. What that lets us do is basically build out the deficit that is needed for that the new projects need to be added so that the government can meet that goal. So this charts that you see on the screen right now do a similar breakdown for Kenya, where you can see on the top here that there is a gray bar that basically points to the unannounced projects, which point to the the deficit in capacity that Kenya needs to meet in order to reach its government's goal. You can break that information down to individual projects, where I have also highlighted something called Unknown Kenya, which basically refers to those same unannounced projects. So to sum that all up, what you get is basically a ginormous database of all geothermal projects in the world, which is basically designed like a huge pivot table with clients' workflows in mind. It basically is a very intuitive tool where you can basically click in and maybe in 5 or 6 clicks get to the analysis that you wish to look into. It provides insights on various topics. For example, a micro to macro view, be it for information on a specific asset or a particular region or even the globe. You can do the analysis on various perspectives. For example, drilling, capacities, investments, LCOEs on an asset by asset basis, generation, comparing how projects trend, the well cost compares between two specific projects or two specific operators. We keep track of all the new technologies and new developments in the geothermal space, be it potentially converting oil and gas wells for geothermal or technological breakthroughs like AGS and EGS. We provide information on a detailed level for every single project in the world, and also insightful maps with interesting base layers to basically compare the market in different manners. We provide information on the supply chain side of things as well, be it for the EPC contract awards or the turbine contract awards. We develop qualitative screening tools that help you understand the potential of different perspectives. For example, the potential of repurposing existing heating networks in Europe for geothermal, or the potential to decarbonize certain industrial sectors in Europe and instead use geothermal to power or heat that particular building. With all of that, you also get access to an expert team of analysts who dedicatedly work on the geothermal market. We also publish regular analysis on various interesting topics in the market. We publish regular news updates so that our clients and users can stay up to date on every interesting development in the industry. and also a very detailed trends report that covers all the different topics that are trending in that particular quarter. So that brings me to the end of this segment where, I just wanted to give you a brief about what we do at RISAT. I'm now talking about the geothermal market in detail. So I think it's important to first put everything into perspective and talk about why we are talking about geothermal today. If we look at the global power mix, the share of geothermal today is minuscule. In fact, it's so small that I actually need to zoom in further to just see the tiny little slice that geothermal occupies in this huge pie. It is just around 0.3%. And of course, there are what we call traditional renewables like solar and wind, which occupy a much bigger share of this picture. So there's always a conversation that starts, that why are we even talking about geothermal when we have other renewables which are quote unquote doing much better and have a bigger share? And the straightforward answer to that question is that geothermal is not in the race with solar and wind. It is not competing with these intermittent energy sources because geothermal has a very inherent advantage of being a baseload energy source. What it is trying to sort of dig into is the share that gas and coal occupy in this global power mix. So that puts just some things into perspective that it's not the traditional renewables that geothermal is trying to compete against. It's actually one of the key moves in order to decarbonize the heating, cooling, and electricity sector of the world. Now, talking about where are all of these projects located? Geothermal projects are located in over 90 countries globally. But there are a few definite hotspots that dominate this entire picture. So if we talk about the power generation side of things, of course, over 90% of these projects are located along the Pacific Ring of Fire, which is, your Indonesia, Philippines, Japan, down the western coast of the US, and the western coast of Latin and, Central Americas. You also have other tectonic systems, for example, the Great Rift Valley of Kenya, Ethiopia, where all of these projects can sort of be mapped out. When we talk about the heating side of things, just because of the demand that it generates, the key hotspots are generally China and parts of Europe. Now, looking at a brief history of geothermal and the key trends that have emerged over time. If you talk about the power generation side of things at the beginning, of course, Europe and specifically Italy is the home of geothermal, as we all know very, very well. And almost up to 1960s, Italy and Iceland were really the only two countries in the world that were doing geothermal on a commercial scale. But around the 1960s, the late 1960s, while the space race in the US was in full force, the geothermal race was also on, where the Geysers Valley was discovered in California, which basically led to a boom in drilling activity in the 1960s and 1970s in the US. After that, the trend sort of died out a bit. And then again, another region picked it up. So you had basically projects that started up in Philippines and Indonesia, which led to this little spike that you see around the 1990s for, the Asia region. Around the 2000s and 2010s, you had the Middle East, specifically countries like Turkey, New Zealand, and all of these other countries that were, sort of adding new projects. But going forward, there are definitely a few key hotspots that will dominate this picture. One of them is most definitely Asia, which is mainly driven by countries like Indonesia, China, and Philippines, and North America, which is essentially more or less entirely driven by the US. I will talk about it a bit more in my next slide, but just giving you a brief history on the heating side of things as well. Geothermal heating has been predominantly been seen in countries like Iceland, Turkey, Italy, France, and so on. But what happened very interestingly in around the 2010, which is when you see this huge spike in projects, is basically all driven by China. So the interesting story over here is that around the time of the Beijing Olympics in 2008, the authorities were discussing, different solutions for heating the Olympic Village. And geothermal was one of the options that was proposed at the time, but nothing much could be done because of the timeline constraints that were there, and also the fact that there was no nationwide survey done at the time to actually assess where those potential hotspots were. So what they did was basically around that time they started those surveys, and in 2010 they just started this drilling boom and just did not stop. Come to 2022, 2023, China basically drilled almost 90% of all the geothermal heating wells that were drilled in those specific years. But going forward, we do see some regions that are cutting into this dominance, this monopoly that China has in the heating sector today. And I will talk about Europe in more detail in the coming slides, but just touching upon Middle East a bit. So this demand, the drilling demand that you see going forward is not driven by district heating. It is mainly driven by district cooling opportunities that are emerging in countries like UAE and Saudi Arabia. So last year, as you must all be aware as well, the breed drilled this well for, used these existing wells that were drilled outside Masdar city to cool the city. And the pilot was so successful that today those two wells basically meet about 10% of Masdar city's cooling requirements. And looking at how successful this venture was, the Breathe is now looking into more opportunities in other parts of UAE as well, and is also looking into tapping into the data centers segment to basically try to drill wells around data centers that exist in and around the Middle East, and use those wells for both power generation and also cooling of the data center itself. Similar such projects are being undertaken in Saudi Arabia, where KAUST is now doing a pilot for understanding the potential of geothermal power and cooling in those areas. And also we have some, the giga projects that Saudi Arabia is undertaking. For example, the Neom City project, the Red Sea project, where geothermal is a great option for making it 100% renewable development. Now, talking about the power generation side a bit more, and I want to talk about three countries specifically, which are some of the major countries to look out for in the coming years. The first one is Indonesia, where we just recently concluded the 10th International Geothermal Convention and Exhibition in Jakarta, and it was a major event in the geothermal space, of course, where the biggest call in the industry was to basically call for a bigger boom of geothermal in the coming years. There were many key partnerships that were signed. For example, Indonesia signed agreements with Iceland, with New Zealand, with Kenya to develop geothermal and co-develop geothermal in their own countries as well as in other countries, which shows how in Pertamina and Indonesia in general are now looking beyond their own reserves to boost their capacities. Indonesia also currently relies on coal for about 60% of their power supply. The power demand that is the supply that is there currently is about 60% of it is coming from coal. And to line with the renewable targets that the country has, for the sustainability targets that the country has up to 2050, geothermal is expected to play a small but a very vital role in the coming years. And to that effect, we expect Indonesia to reach almost 20 to 23, 24 gigawatts by 2050. And it is mainly spurred by these indications from the government to actually boost geothermal further. Another country that is very important to talk about is the US, where, back in 2022, of course, the IRA was passed and it did have some incentives for geothermal specifically. But what also happened simultaneously was the launch of the Earth Shots initiative, which is essentially aimed at bringing down the LCOE of geothermal by 90% by 2035. What this announcement, combined with all the funding rounds that the Geothermal Technologies Office has been doing in these last 2 years, has been key in basically bringing about a revival of geothermal in the US. Because in the last couple of years, the industry has sort of seen a stagnation. But going forward, with the reliance on EGS increasing more and more, with the government really incentivizing EGS development, we expect geothermal to kick off again, and it is led by companies like Fervo Energy, which is currently on its way to start the first commercial EGS project in the world. The US Department of Energy also put out a roadmap a couple of months back, which basically indicated a target of about 90 to 130 gigawatts of geothermal by 2050. And most of it is coming from EGS, of course, because the past geological surveys done in the US have essentially revealed that the hydrothermal potential in the US is around 6 gigawatts. So everything on top of that will most certainly be met by EGS development. Although you would notice that we are not showing anything close to that 90 gigawatt picture, because being a market intelligence firm, we cannot take government's goals as at face value. Many times what we do is basically we look at the government's goal and then we try to break that down into what that means for individual projects. And looking at the historical growth rates for the US in the last couple of years, and looking at the timeline that it takes to develop geothermal projects, and a lot of different factors such as availability of land rights, the political environment, and so on and so forth, we expect that geothermal will, in the US will reach somewhere close to 24 gigawatts by 2050. So that's the story for the US. And the third country that I want to talk to you about is Kenya, which is a very interesting country and has, sort of been in the limelight in the last couple of months and years. Of course, as we're all aware, COP28 was wildly successful for Kenya, where they signed over $4 billion in deals for geothermal projects. And owing to that, we've been seeing a lot of new announcements that are coming in Kenya. So Kenya historically today it stands at just shy of 1 gigawatt, and most of it comes from one legacy field, which is the Olkaria field. While they have started developing the Menengai field with the first unit started and the second unit, starting under construction right now, we see Kenya shifting and looking beyond these two key fields that they have identified. And one of the biggest ones that everyone's talking about is the Paka field, which I think last year everybody would have read the announcement as well. They reached this historical productivity on the well, which is around 22 megawatts, which is one of the highest in the world. So that's one field that's being developed and looked at a closer level. Another one, and this is the one that the GDC signed a partnership with Pertamina just last week, was basically to develop the Suswa field, which is about supposed to be 100 megawatt field. GDC has already drilled wells at this field and it's already sustaining, and these wells can sustain a capacity of around 70 megawatts. So they will be drilling additional wells to basically meet that 100 megawatt capacity that the project is expected to have. So these key developments that are happening in Kenya definitely point to things moving in the right direction. We also have interesting partnerships with companies like Microsoft to develop an industrial park. There are announcements with Fortescue to talking about green hydrogen electrolyzer facilities and so on. So that's bringing a lot of attention to Kenya in recent times. Now, talking about the costs, you can see that geothermal is on a bit of an upward trajectory, and we are breaking down these investments to all of these different components as well. And you can see definitely that power plant construction is one of the biggest components that goes into developing a geothermal project, followed closely by the cost that is incurred by drilling of these particular wells. The uptick that you see, this dramatic rise from the current levels that you see in the picture today, is basically coming in from all these key developments that are expected to come in. We have strategies, for example, what Pertamina is trying to do. They have a quick win plan to reach 1 gigawatt in capacity in the next 2 years, which is relying on basically relying on resource optimization strategies. For example, adding a binary or an ORC turbine to existing flash projects, bringing online some of the greenfield developments that were in the pipeline for the last couple of years, and so on. So all of these are expected to basically boost Indonesia's capacity further. This year we see this dramatic growth from the last year, mainly coming in from the starting of the Tohara project, which is one of the biggest projects in the world today. And that is essentially causing the investments from last year to this year to almost double. Another exciting one that's driving a lot of the investments, at least up to 2030, is the drilling at the Furvos project at Cape Station in Utah. So a 400 megawatt project, and looking at their EIA, per EIA documents, they're expected to drill up to 300 wells. So all of these will definitely drive a huge demand and a huge amount of spending from these operators, adding to the revenue of suppliers. So a potential windfall is expected in the coming years. Now diving deeper into Europe and really focusing on what's happening in the market today. Just looking at the current picture, just looking at what role does Europe play in today's global geothermal landscape. It has about a 10% share in the global power generation picture, about almost 1.8 or 1.9 gigawatts. And it is mainly coming in from five countries, which is Italy, Iceland, Germany, Portugal, and France. Although a lot of these, at least the top two that I mentioned, are driving most of this demand, they are also legacy markets. Going forward, we don't expect power to be the major driver or the major growth story in Europe. It is certainly expected to be in cases where it is a combined heat and power project, but we don't expect to see a lot of major, power projects coming in Europe. There are definitely some countries, for example, Croatia, where drilling is being done, which is another market to look out for in the coming term, which also is part of the other Europe going forward. But historically speaking, Iceland and Italy have dominated the picture by far. Looking at the heat side of things, Europe has almost a 20% share in the current picture. Iceland here is again one of the major dominating countries when you talk about Europe. And again, it is now also a legacy market because Iceland, if you look at their heating mix today, already 90% of it comes in from geothermal. So there's not a lot of room for displacing other energy sources, as you would see for perhaps a country like Germany or Netherlands. But definitely, it is, Iceland has been drilling contingency wells owing to the current volcano eruptions that have been happening on a more frequent basis. So we have been seeing some tender announcements in the recent times where they are drilling these wells just as a contingency in case one of their major power plants stops producing because of volcano eruptions. Another key country to talk about when you talk about the Europe's heating picture is, of course, Hungary, where Hungary is currently in its year tenure, completing its close to completing its tenure as EU's presidency. And this year, they have really pushed very hard on boosting geothermal infrastructure, calling for a Europe strategy for tackling geothermal, and is also currently trying to collaborate with Poland so that Poland can continue these conversations during its presidency in the next year. Hungary also published a national strategy a couple of months back to double their geothermal capacity by 2030. Now, this strategy talked about both power and heating side of things. So definitely, it points towards some moves being made in Central Europe that point towards things going in the right direction. But if we talk about the biggest drivers of growth in Europe, it is definitely expected to be countries like Western European countries like Germany and Netherlands. The picture here is quite straightforward. Back in 2022, when the whole Russia-Ukraine conflict began, after Western Europe applied sanctions on Russia, they were left basically scrambling for a replacement for all the natural gas that they were importing from Russia. Germany alone was relying on Russia to meet 70% of its district heating demands. So, of course, at the time, other countries stepped in to help meet this goal. But what this did was basically it sparked a conversation about energy sovereignty. Energy sovereignty was a new topic that was added to the energy trilemma in 2022, which essentially means that a country is independent of other foreign factors for its energy sources, or it's basically meeting its energy requirements, so that so that no other external factors can influence or rather cause issues to their energy supply. So what Germany did at the time was they published this roadmap to reach 10 terawatt hours of geothermal generation by 2030. And then a couple of months back, they also released a heat planning act, which I will talk about in the coming slides. Another country to look out for is certainly Netherlands, where they have a similar roadmap in place, along with countries like France, Hungary, who all have basically jumped on this bandwagon that Germany initiated to basically put out roadmaps to boost their geothermal infrastructure further. All this conversation is, of course, coming in from essentially decarbonizing the heating sector in Europe. So what we did was, and this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning of my presentation, that we developed screening tools to understand the potential of various factors that are influencing the geothermal space. One of the biggest topics is, of course, decarbonizing the heating sector in Europe. So to that effect, what we did was we scored all 8,700 towns in Europe that have a district heating network on all of these parameters that I have listed on the right of the screen. So for example, what is the thermal gradient in that particular community or rather that municipality? What is the heat flow that has been seen in that particular area? Do they have a history of geothermal drilling or oil and gas drilling to gauge what the availability of skilled labor is like? What is the availability of land rigs in that particular area? Is what is the population and the population density of that particular area? Because that is a very important factor, because if it's a very small community or a small municipality of less than 1,000 people, then it's not a very lucrative opportunity for developers in the geothermal space. What is the overwhelming sentiment around surrounding geothermal in that particular municipality? And a reason for taking such a qualitative, you might say, factor into account is basically because geothermal is very influenced by public perception. So for example, a couple of years back, there was an earthquake in France at one of their EGS pilots, and there was so much public outcry after that, after the earthquake happened, that all EGS projects in France are basically indefinitely suspended right now. Similarly, on a more positive side, Germany has been the German like government has been doing an excellent job in convincing the local communities to go in for geothermal. So it includes visits by the chancellor to ever sites, local municipal authorities going in and meeting with developers at their geothermal project sites, and conducting town halls and community outreach programs to basically educate and improve the public perception surrounding geothermal. So that has led to a rise in positive perception around geothermal in Germany. So these are two ways in which we have seen, that development pace in a country is influenced by these factors. So that's why we took sentiment into account. Another factor to consider, especially when you look at countries like Iceland, is what is the current heating mix like right now? And what are there any alternatives to geothermal that already exist? For example, what is the share of biomass in that particular heating mix? Because if the share of biomass is already overwhelmingly high, it is very unlikely that geothermal can really dig into that dominance. On the other hand, if the heating mix is currently dominated by fossil fuels, then geothermal still has a very good chance of sort of having a good trajectory in that particular region or country. And lastly, what is the government's initiatives for geothermal in that particular state or country level? So these are all the factors that we took into account, and we scored every single municipality in this chart that you see on all of those parameters, and essentially came up with about 700 or so towns or municipalities in Europe, which are excellent candidates for retrofitting their existing heating networks to geothermal networks. Now, talking about Germany a bit more, and I was just mentioning the Heat Planning Act that Germany rolled out earlier this year. So it basically what it means is that on a federal level, the government has asked the municipalities to come up with a plan to decarbonize their heating sector by 2050. These proposals are due by 2027, 2028. And essentially, when we saw this announcement, of course, it did not outright give a number that geothermal could reach. So what we did was we analyzed what this means for Germany in terms of decarbonizing its heating sector and what the potential for geothermal could look like. So with that, we came up with these three scenarios. And at the bottom of the chart, you can also see what the 2030 target for the government was. And we developed these three scenarios, which is basically a balanced scenario, an aggressive and a conservative scenario. So all three of these scenarios talk about the share that geothermal would have in this decarbonized heat mix. So if you talk about the most aggressive scenario, we are basically saying that about 75% of this decarbonized heat mix would be geothermal and 25% could be biomass. Arguably, it sounds like a very ludicrous and an ambitious target, but it also goes to show how much geothermal can potentially grow in the most ideal scenario. The more balanced scenario, it is just something more aligned with what we currently have in our forecast, in our database as well, is basically saying that there would be a 50-50 share of geothermal and biomass in the new decarbonized heating mix by 2050. And the most conservative scenario basically says that the share of geothermal would be 25% in this new mix. Speaking of all of these scenarios in terms of dollars and what that means for the space, is basically saying that in the most balanced scenario, we're talking about in the period of 2025 to 2045, which is about a 20-year period, we're talking about almost $65 billion invested in the German geothermal medium deep to deep heating space to essentially meet that capacity target. Now, if I break this number down to what it means on a year on year spending and put it into perspective, $65 billion in 20 years essentially means about $3.5 billion invested for every single year. Now, putting that number into context, the global spending, and I'm saying global over here, on the medium deep to deep geothermal space last year was just over $1 billion. So the scale to which geothermal could grow in Germany is huge, and there is a huge space as well for developers to come in. There are a few caveats that the Heat Planning Act has in place where geothermal is further incentivized over biomass. One of those is essentially a very straightforward one where they have a limit on the pipelines or the network size that a newly constructed biomass network can have. So the limit is 20 kilometers, but there is no such limit put in place for for geothermal specifically. So there are these small incentives that have been put in place where geothermal can benefit from these advantages that are already in place. But zooming out and talking about how policies and government legislations are vital for shaping the geothermal infrastructure and the development base going forward. One of them was definitely Germany's Heat Planning Act, where it's basically calling for a roadmap on a bottom-up level where every municipality individually gives out a plan to decarbonize their heating networks, so that on a country level, the whole all of Germany can basically be converted to decarbonized heating. Hungary's national strategy is another such move where government is basically pushing and spearheading the geothermal development pace and sort of incentivizing geothermal. But another key interesting case to talk about here is also Kenya, where they've taken a very innovative approach. So of course, develop these sort of national strategies, these heat planning acts are one way to look at how governments can support geothermal. Another one is basically how governments can tackle the existing challenges that are there in the geothermal space today. One of the key ones that have been identified is basically the geothermal is considered a very high risk and very capex intensive venture, and that is why many developers are reluctant to enter this space. So to tackle that, what Kenya has done now is basically they've introduced a public-private partnership, which is something that they piloted at the Menengai field, and it has been wildly successful as well. So within this public-private partnership scheme, the risk for a geothermal development is not solely borne by the developer. It is shared among a lot of entities. For example, the geothermal development company, the developer themselves, be it someone like Ormat or Kengen or whoever you would like to talk about. the transmission company, like the utilities basically, and so on. So all of these different entities basically share the risk that come with a geothermal project, thereby reducing operator risk and also improving their cash flow as well. Another such strategy is basically another such plan that is currently being put in place is Indonesia's new renewable energy policy that is expected to be introduced in the parliament in the next administration, where they're basically talking about streamlining the regulatory processes, which is identified as another major challenge for developers. As we are all aware, one of the biggest challenges that the industry struggles with is permitting delays, where projects get held back by 5, 7, 10 years even, just because of the delays that occur due to permitting and jumping through all the regulatory loopholes. Just last week, sorry, the week before last, when I was in Jakarta, I heard a very interesting thing from one of the people in the energy ministry, was that to develop a geothermal project in Indonesia, you basically need to get regulatory approvals from over 11 ministries in the country. Each of these ministries have about 3 or 4 different regulatory compliances that need to be met. So essentially, by the time a developer, submits the first permit, applies for the permit, to the point where they actually begin the process of drilling or even power plant construction or commercial operations, at all of these various stages, they are dealing with about 50 to 60 different regulatory processes. So to streamline all of these, the government is launching a new and renewable energy policy, which should definitely help reduce these different, hurdles that the developers need to jump through. Another key one that I also talked about earlier is the U.S. Government's Inflation Reduction Act, which while there were a lot of different tax incentives for a lot of different energy sources, but one for geothermal specifically, most of the 30% tax incentive was there for the ground source heat pumps. And while that's not a market that we at Tristat cover, just qualitatively speaking, after the IRA was brought into force or enacted in 2022, between that point and today, almost 25 states have passed legislations that incentivize ground source heat pumps. That just speaks to how, on a federal level, the government can at least initiate the momentum that is needed for the geothermal industry to grow further. So this is talking a bit about the policies and just the map of where all geothermal policies are in the world. And of course, all of these different countries have something or another. There are also a few countries in this list that you might be surprised by, because these countries don't have any geothermal projects in place. But certainly the government has done some level of, groundwork, homework, you could call it, to basically incentivize geothermal should the country ever turn to it. Geothermal also faces with this issue that, because of how long the timelines are for developing a project, it also faces so it faces geopolitical issues. For example, if let's assume in a scenario where a newly elected administration has just, started their term, and say a month from now, a new geothermal project is announced. From the time this announcement is made to the time where it actually starts up could anywhere be between 7 years. Let's assume it takes 7 years. There is no certainty for the current administration that they would be re-elected in the next time. So that is one of the reasons why we have seen that it has not become it's not a huge priority for governments, because it's not geothermal is today not seen as a quick win for the administration. Solar and wind, on the other hand, have a much shorter development pace, and that's why we see many countries opting for prioritizing these energy sources in their journey of decarbonization. So reducing these regulatory timelines, these permitting delays, is definitely one of the key moves so that geothermal can be brought back into limelight and governments can talk about it a bit more. Geothermal also offers a lot of co-location opportunities, which also talk about optimization of the actual geothermal resource. So you have there are all these announcements of green hydrogen electrolyzer facilities in conjunction with a geothermal project. So these are sort of ways in which hydrogen these days is called the Swiss knife of the energy transition. So combining geothermal with that is a very easy win to basically generate green hydrogen and add further in revenue for the developer. You also have your lithium extraction projects from geothermal brine, which is a hot topic in the industry, especially when you talk about the supply demand balances of the battery sector. There are so many projects that have already been announced. For example, Vulcan Energy Resources zero carbon lithium project along the Upper Rhine Valley of Germany. Control Thermal Resources Health Kitchen project in the US, which is expected to actually start later this year, and so on and so forth. So there are all of these different opportunities that geothermal offers. We also have heard announcements, for example, Climeworks' project in Iceland about direct air capture and storing the captured CO2 in the geothermal reservoir. So all of these are different ways in which a developer can optimize the resource that they have in place, which is geothermal energy, which can either be used for power or heat, but also all of these different opportunities. But at the beginning of my presentation, I also talked about the fact that there are some hotspots that currently dominate the geothermal space. But to truly bring about the geothermal wave or the geothermal decade, as we've all been calling the 2020s, technological breakthroughs are absolutely vital. So you have these two camps essentially, your EGS camp and your AGS camp, right? And both of these aim to tackle the same challenge, which is basically unlocking geothermal worldwide so that you can drill virtually anywhere to extract geothermal power or heat. For EGS, it's basically fracking. So there are not a lot of areas where it could be a viable solution. In that, there will be a lot of negative perception, a lot of public pushback if you talk about fracking in those areas. But definitely, US is riding this EGS wave, already having the existing shale expertise. And projects like Forvo Energy are key for reaching that 190 to 130 gigawatt goal that US has put out. For other areas where fracking might not be a viable option, you have closed loop technologies which is also your AGS projects like Ever Technologies, where it's essentially building a giant radiator in the earth and you can drill wells literally anywhere. Such solutions are key ideal for landlocked or other very population dense areas. For example, countries like Singapore, where they don't have a lot of land to develop a solar farm or a wind farm, but definitely can look into an Everloop, for example, to basically produce geothermal power for those particular for their city or state. Just bringing all of my talking points into one page over here, and I'm almost actually through with my presentation as well, and I want to leave about 10 minutes for this Q&A. So what are the key challenges that geothermal sector needs to tackle to reach this goal that they have for 2050? The biggest supporter of this, the biggest pillar of driving this growth is, of course, the government, where, regulation, I talked at length about the streamlining of regulatory processes. Funding incentives like the IRA, which have actually led to a lot of startups, EGS startups entering the geothermal space. And, talking about pilot studies and pilot projects, which they would not have been able to do without the funding incentives that the government has been providing. International cooperation and agreements, for example, Indonesia signing cooperation agreements with New Zealand and Iceland, expanding beyond their country, for example, entering the Turkish space or the Kenyan space. Kenya collaborating with countries like Ethiopia and Tanzania to drill geothermal wells via their drilling company, and so on. Disruptive technologies like EGS, AGS, breakthrough drilling technologies. For example, you have your millimeter wave drilling, plasma bit drilling, and from companies like GA drilling and so on. Support from the oil and gas industry. Oil and gas industry is a sister industry to geothermal in many ways, where you would see that a lot of people, or rather a lot of players in the geothermal space, essentially have some background in the oil and gas industry as well. So it's a very direct, very natural transition for people in the oil and gas industry and for E&Ps in general to diversify their portfolio to show some green revenue as well. You have companies, for example, Chevron now entering the geothermal developer space, talking about co-developing a project along with Pertamina in Indonesia. They already have the existing subsurface experience. And they can also consider potential pilot projects to repurpose their abandoned or mature oil and gas wells on their own assets to decarbonize at least the drilling process of those particular on those particular assets. Lastly, you have co-location projects like lithium extraction, green hydrogen, silica extraction, carbon capture and storage, and so on and so forth. So these are all different pillars that are needed basically for so that this we can tackle this challenge that is being posed today on how to scale up geothermal and bring about a boom in the industry. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening in. I hope you found this discussion insightful. And I want to take the rest of this time that we have to answer some questions that I can already see are coming up in the chat.
Thank you very much, Shruti, for that pretty detailed depiction of the geothermal world. You've mentioned a lot of interesting things, quite some comments coming from the audience. You have also, let's say, made some comments that I think have sparked some, let's say it was thought-provoking in a sense, right? Because you've talked about EGS, you've talked about deep geothermal systems, what the future could look like. I think one of the things that really got to me as one of the, let's say, participants here is understanding how important government involvement is and how that short-term mindset is really not in line with our future plan of a cleaner future. So I guess we really need to reconsider and think of ways that we need to have people in the government that actually understand the gravity of the situation and what needs to be done. But that's for another day. A lot of good topics. Might call you back for a panel discussion with
Yes,
some of our
absolutely.
participants here. Yeah, so I'll jump right into the questions. I would like to let the audience know that most probably we will not be able to tackle all of them. This is a very engaging Q&A, but we do promise that we'll come up with an event, hopefully as a panel discussion, and then tackle these important important questions. So we have a question here from Fahad Ahmed who said, is a database generated by Rystad Energy available to all users or it's restricted to the company only?
So our database is basically available on a subscription basis. So how it works is basically if you're interested, you can get in touch with me, or you can just contact support at Rystad Energy, and we would be happy to set up a demo and walk you through the entire tool, show you exactly how everything works and how you can get access to the dashboard. And then it works on a subscription based service where you subscribe for a year and you get unlimited access to all of that data.
Right, perfect. So, excuse me, there are plans in place. So, essentially, reaching out to Rystad and then getting the information.
Yeah.
That looked like a very interesting dashboard with a lot of good information. So, we have Ernesto Petruzzi, I hope I said that correctly, from Italy said, Dear Shruti, thank you so much for this interesting contribution. About the Italy future geothermal development, what do you think is the most important factor that's hindering further increase of geothermal contribution in the energy mix? And this is coming from one of the powerhouses of geothermal, so that's an interesting question.
Gabriel, your voice broke a bit over there for me. Can you just repeat that?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, so the question from Ernesto is, what do you think is the most important factor that's hindering the increase of the geothermal contribution in the energy mix in Italy?
In Italy, that's a very interesting question, actually. So, with Italy, it's again a matter of political priorities, where what we have been seeing is that, of course, it is a powerhouse of geothermal. It's a legacy, what we consider a legacy or a very well established market. But in the recent years, what we have seen is that there has been a lot of issues with the renewal of the old permits, especially with what we have seen based on the more publicly available information, is that NL has been facing some issues with negotiating the terms with renewing their existing leases, and because of that, basically since the negotiations are not going in the way NL hoped for, they have basically put a pause on all new developments in the country. So that's basically what's led to this stagnation in recent years.
Thank you for that
That's
answer.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be dismissive of those processes, but you see how there's always a trend that it's processes and legislation, and these are the kind of things that are holding us back. And we've been doing so much work in the innovation segment of geothermal recently, moving to hotter temperatures, developing technologies and tools. And it's really a pity that we don't push further on this. So hopefully in the coming years we can. There is a question from Eric Moigny who says he has experience in drilling wells in the oil and gas sector. So the question is, what can be done to disrupt the geothermal sector and make it more profitable?
Make it more profitable. That's the challenge, right, that everyone is
Hmm.
trying to tackle these days. So in terms of breakthroughs technologies, of course, you have your EGS and AGS, which are essentially aiming to tackle the challenge of geothermal being so location restricted historically. And when you talk about profitability, there are projects, for example, very recently, Fovo Energy put out a press release. It was a very interesting read, actually, where last year when they did their, Project Red pilot, the productivity of that well was 3.5 megawatts. But in the recent announcement, one of their wells actually managed to sustain a production of 10 megawatts. Now, when you look at a typical geothermal well, in the most global averages I'm talking about here, the characteristics, of course, vary from country to country and even state to state. The global average of productivity per well is around 5 megawatts. So already this one well is producing double the electricity that another well, a typical geothermal hydrothermal well, is producing. So moves like that are definitely key. And they've also, Fovo also reported that they have brought down reduction in their drilling times by about 70%. That again, said a reduction in drilling time basically means that, the amount of money you spend on rigs, of course, reduces by 70% as well. So that's another, key challenge that geothermal can, another way in which the costs can reduce and then become more profitable. Already, in some cases, when you look at it, you have companies, for example, Supreme and KS Orca in Indonesia, where the power plants that they set up are what they call modular solutions. So it essentially means that the equipment can just be it's not a lot of time that they take in the construction, and they call it a more cost effective way of developing the geothermal projects. So already there are a lot of innovations and innovative approaches that developers are taking. But at the same time, especially when it comes to startups that currently struggle with funding, government incentives have been very key in making geothermal more profitable for those developers.
So just to thank you for that answer. To echo your message, incentives have been helping a lot. But one of the challenges, it is how to live in a world, in the future world without incentives, right? We need to bring the cost of megawatt hour that's close to hydrocarbons. And
Yes.
to echo your message on the further work, there's currently ongoing work that I'm aware of on super hard rock, essentially
Yeah.
working on enthalpy and the ability to have 20 megawatts out of a well system. And now the game changes, right? And so for
Yeah.
this, you need technical innovation to make the tools work, but you also realize that at those hotter temperatures, things at 200 C and a 400 C are completely different. So it's exciting. I really think I'm sure
Yes.
that a good part of this audience knows about it. The upcoming period is going to be a very interesting one. And just to echo a message here, there is going to be a geothermal event coming up in Munich here in about a week, about 10 days, the Geothermal Summit. And there's a lot of these topics, right? On closed loop, on super hot, on the governmental legislation. How do we make the financial models work? So really positive things. I will move on with some additional questions. We do have some comments
Gabriel,
here.
before that, I just wanted to add on a bit, just talking about profitability a bit.
Mhm.
There are actually some cases, if you compare levelized costs, at least, especially when you look at some countries, more established countries, like for example, Indonesia, just taking an example, since the conversation was about Indonesia a lot in the last 2-3 weeks.
Mhm.
There are a few projects, actually, very interestingly enough, where their levelized costs are actually comparable to other renewable energy sources. So, especially when it comes to the more brownfield developments, your unit 2s, unit 3s, unit 4s, where all the upfront cost, like rather the power plant construction cost is lower. there have been cases where the levelized cost is actually significantly competitive with other renewable energy sources. So just wanted to leave it at that. Yeah.
That's positive. Thank you so much. There's been some comments coming in from different audience members. One was on the EGS segment, making a difference between what fracturing is. And by the way, fracking is, there's always been this misconception about how it's spelled and what it really is. There's been a very general public perception from non-experts on what it is. And I think we really need to do a better job at explaining to the world what stresses are and how the
Yeah.
earth rock mechanics works. But the comment was that when we talk about EGS, it's important to mention that sometimes you have high permeability systems where you don't really fail the rock in tensile mode and you just inject, right? So this gets
Yes.
accepted a lot more in different segments.
I think that one of the biggest challenges is basically community outreach, especially with these projects. So a good example of that is actually the Eden project, like the one in Cornwall, where we actually talked with some people over there, like the developers and so on. And what the government has been very successful in doing is that they've done a lot of community outreach, a lot of these town halls, just educating the public that this is good for you. This is not that we're not fracturing a rock, we are not going to cause earthquakes, we are taking the highest levels of precautions to make sure that there is no earthquakes that happen. And that has been what is it's being basically like just the concept, the perception from the public has been very positive, where now at least the community over there is very positive and very supportive of the geothermal project that's coming up. So that is one of the key ways, just educating the public is one of the major challenges to tackle.
Absolutely. I'm thinking we're going to organize a panel in the near future to talk about it because induced seismicity comes from injection of fluids, and a lot of the people don't really understand the process. We've had some bad things happen in the past. We
Yes.
didn't do a good job by explaining and being open and transparent, and I think this is where we need to learn. But let's move on to a couple more questions before we close today. Here is a question that came from Eric Deliak. He says, "What is your forecast for spending annual growth in geothermal over the next 5 years?"
So, our forecast for spending in the next 5 years, let me just pull up a chart to show you that a bit more.
Mhm.
Um, Second, going to one of my previous slides, we talked about spending. Yeah. All right. So, how we basically break down the spending of a geothermal project is we look at, the cost. There are a lot of things that go into this model that we have developed, where, we take factors such as what's the capacity of the project, how many wells are expected to be drilled, what's the temperature of the wells, what type of turbine are they, what type of plant technology, or whether is it a flash turbine or a binary turbine, that sort of factors. Is it a green field in development or a brown field development, and so on. So all of these different parameters, go into are taken into account when we develop these sort of spending breakdowns. And as you can see, on a year-on-year average, it trends at around $8 to $10 billion invested every single year between now and the next 5 years, really. So it's a dramatic uptick from the last couple of years where it was just around $4 billion, and it is spurred by all of these major projects that are in the pipeline. You have major projects coming in from the US. You have this year we have Tahara, that's coming up, which is like a 174 megawatt project. So that in itself is driving a lot of that investment that you see for 2024. You also have developments in Indonesia that are coming up, which are expected to drive a significant portion of this growth going forward. This, of course, is just talking about the power generation side of things. On the heating side, it is a similar picture where it aligns a lot with the balance scenario that I had showed you in the Germany slide, where it's basically, just pull that up. Yeah. So this balance scenario that we have, so in the next 5 years, it's basically for Germany alone, we're expecting about $3.8 billion. And on a global level, it is just around, I think, around $8 or $10 billion, but I'm not exactly sure. So it's just like a ballpark figure.
Thank you very much. I'll take one last one here. We have a couple of comments from Marcus Osterberger, and I'm not sure you'd be able to answer this. I think it's why is Pertamina going to Turkey? If in case
Why
the
is
business
Pertamina
environment,
going to Turkey? Yeah. So
yeah, if the business environment in Indonesia is so favorable.
yeah, so Pertamina has been on a bit of an expansion spree lately, where they are looking at quick ways to boost their capacity. So it's part of their quick win strategy, where they want to basically reach this 1 gigawatt goal in the next 2 years. So that includes resource optimization at existing fields, and also partnering up and signing partnerships with other going beyond Indonesia as well. So they want to co-develop the Suswa field with the GDC. They're also looking into partnerships with with Turkey for on similar basis, where they want to acquire projects or co-develop projects. Right now they are not looking into develop these projects by themselves. They want to do it on a partnership basis right now. So
Like,
they have also, these have always, these sort of agreements have also always come on the backs of state visits. So, there was a state visit recently to Kenya, and that's when all of those different, partnerships were announced. Another similar state visit that had happened was basically a visit to Colombia. But so far, nothing has been made publicly available. Like they've not disclosed any announcements. But usually, these sort of agreements and these cooperation agreements come on the backs of state visits. So they are driven by the government's, long-term visions and strategies.
all right, thank you very much for that clarification. I'd like to make a comment here. We have a comment from Gavin Liu talking about the Geo project. I mentioned to you, Shruti, earlier when we
Yeah.
talked. It's essentially a consortium between SPE and Project Innerspace, but it's a way of investing DOE, Department of Energy, money in the next 3 years in such a way to fast track geothermal. Never ever did we realize before how oil and gas and geothermal professionals can work together, can rebuild things better together, can exchange their experiences, and Geode will be one of those. So keep an eye out because we will be doing a webinar in October explaining what Geode is, who is involved, and opportunities to volunteer in the project. I'd also like to thank you, Shruti, for being here today, for your time. This was a very insightful presentation, really opened up the appetite for a panel discussion. So keep an eye out. I think we need to ask the tough questions, why
Yes.
certain things are not as good as they can be, right?
Yeah.
And I would like to invite the audience to follow, well, obviously follow you and reach out for any questions they might have on your dashboard. And then follow us mostly on LinkedIn on the posts for the upcoming geothermal talks. We have one on geothermal well completion coming up here in 2 to 3 weeks. So keep an eye out. And we have some more work coming in the next month. So we're really trying to stay engaged. Love the fact that we have such a good audience, good numbers. We have gone above 600 participants in the past 15 months. And we have to keep growing. So thank you all for the support. Shruti, thank you for being here. I will send the recording and the slides to all the registered participants as soon as I can get that from you. Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Thank you so much for this great conversation and a very good Q&A as well. And yeah, just leaving you all with the note that, if you have any questions, you want to connect a bit more and talk about geothermal more and what we at that can do for you, then please feel free to reach out. I've dropped my email in the chat as well. So happy to continue discussions over there.